Hey everybody, it's Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get to have a wonderful chit-chat with other lovely, talented, creative, funny, inspiring writers. And I think inspiring is a great word to use because regardless of where they are in their career, maybe they're just starting out or maybe they've written 20 books, I always leave these conversations feeling inspired, feeling invigorated, feeling happy that I'm a writer, because I'm like, hey, I'm in company with this really interesting person. And it's an engaging profession to me and I love it. So I love having conversations where we can talk shop and really get to the bones of what it's like to be a writer, to be a novelist, to go through the publication process and to share notes. And today there was a lot of shop talk, which was great. I mean, I love it. Hopefully you find it interesting as well. Today I talked to Lindsay Cameron. So Lindsay, she worked many years as a corporate lawyer in both Vancouver and New York City, and she kind of like me, no aspirations and no training to become a writer. But she kind of had that sense as she was working as a lawyer of like, hey, there's enough interesting things and quirky things and funny things that happen in my job that somebody should write a book about this. And then having the realization, well, maybe I should be the one to write a book about this, which she did. And that became her first novel, Biglaw, which was published in 2015. And she has since gone on to publish two other novels, both in the suspense kind of thriller categories. And her most recent work is, hang on, I got it right here, is No One Needs to Know, which just came out in May of this year. But it was just interesting comparing notes with somebody who also didn't know what they were doing as a writer, kind of didn't tell anybody that they were writing a book. And then once that book was done, didn't quite know what to do with it and had to basically just start Googling, what do I do with this book, and understanding, I need to find an agent. And what does an agent do? And how does the publishing industry work? So it was a really fun conversation because it was interesting to hear it from her perspective and then mentally kind of compared to my own. And she was fascinating. She has a lot of tremendous advice in this interview. So if you are aspiring writer, a struggling writer, there's a lot of very practical tidbits that she discusses that I think you're going to find very engaging. So anyway, it was a fun conversation. I think you're going to like this one. This is my talk with Lindsay Cameron.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good.
Nice to meet you. I know we started communicating back in March, and then unfortunately your daughter was sick the one time we had scheduled.
Yes, yeah. Nothing derails things faster than a call from the school that you have to come pick up your child.
Totally. And in a way, it's also kind of nice. You're like, all right, I'm done with any other responsibilities and I don't care.
Well, that's yes. Everything else is on the back burner at that point. It's true. Well, thank you for rescheduling.
I assume she's fine by now.
Yes, yeah. Very minor.
That's good. Where are you? Where are you located?
So normally I'm in New York City. Right now I'm on Vancouver Island. So I'm hoping that our Wi-Fi is spotty. I'm hoping that this goes okay.
Are you on vacation?
Well, yes. We come back here every summer for 2 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Now, do you own a place there, or are you like Airbnb?
We do, yeah. So my sister's family's here, my mother's here, and we have a house here. So it's kind of, it is vacation. We're in a different spot, but
right.
It's something that we do every year.
Are you from there originally?
Yes, from Vancouver.
Yeah.
So we're on Vancouver Island now.
Okay. Wonderful. So growing up in
New York, I've lived in New York for almost 20 years now.
Okay. So that's obviously a huge difference between New York City and Vancouver. What was it like growing up in Vancouver?
I mean, it was great. Yeah,
Beautiful.
Vancouver. you've got the mountains, you've got the
Right.
ocean, so you're always outside, lots of outdoor activities for kids. It was really great.
Yeah. I've lived in Colorado for the past 26 years. So I have such an appreciation for, I mean, we don't have the water, but I have such an appreciation for just like, driving every day. I'm like, oh, there are the Rocky Mountains right there every
Yes,
day. And,
yeah.
you
And
try not to,
Colorado is beautiful.
it is.
Like but you're lucky to live there.
I am. Yeah. I was in right before Colorado. My wife at the time and I were in Miami and we're like, this is no place to start a family.
That's very different.
It's very different. So I've learned over the years that I really like my space. I really like not too many people.
Yeah.
Although, all that changes over time because now Colorado is very crowded. But yeah, in New York City. So for example, I go to New York City usually for Thriller Fest.
Mhm.
And I love going to New York City, but after 3 days, I'm like, it's too many people. I gotta get
Yes,
out of here.
yeah, it's definitely not for everybody. We're lucky to be able to give our kids kind of both of those worlds. When we're in New York, we live in an apartment there, and so they have, like, the urban feel, and then when we come out here in the summer, they're on their bikes and they disappear, and they have that, nature suburban summer. The
Yeah.
same thing that I had.
And it'll be interesting to see as they age and mature, like, which one of those they gravitate towards. And my guess is they'll probably different kids will have different inclinations towards, nature versus dense city.
Yes, yeah. I get the feeling my son is gonna gravitate towards nature and my daughter's gonna gravitate towards city, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's how my kids would be for sure. So when you were growing up, I'm always curious about kind of roots of creativity. Um, were you were you exhibiting signs of wanting to be a writer, or did you come from, maybe a creative or artistic family at all?
Well, I was a big bookworm when I
Mhm.
was child and was always reading. I was writing short stories, just doing a lot of writing in school. If there was ever a choice between, do a paper or do a presentation, I was doing the paper. Uh, but it wasn't something that I thought I was gonna make a career out of. It was just
Sure.
something that I enjoyed. And then I did what a lot of people who enjoy writing do. I went to law school instead.
You made a smart decision, is what you did.
Yeah.
It's hard to
But then
conceptualize
I
this,
gravitated towards back to writing, so maybe
but
I
that's
should have
just
done
it,
that
I think.
first.
I think out of, so many people that I've talked to, it just seems like if you are naturally a writer, which I think some people naturally are just writers, I think that's gonna come out of you one way or another, no matter how much you fight it, and sometimes it doesn't happen till you're 60. Um, but, for me, it was 33, and I had no background in it at all. I just started writing, and I've seen it time and time again. You try to do the sensible thing, you try to make money in a real job, and then you're like, "No, I'm gonna write books," even though it's crazy to do that. So
I think
you
it's so true. There's so many times I meet people and writing is not their first career. They went and they did something with their college degree that's entirely different. A lot of lawyers end up writing the books that were probably in them since they were children, but they didn't realize, and they went sort of the more, practical route of law, and that was definitely my case. I didn't know that I was a writer kind of until I sat down and started trying to do it.
it's because it's such a risky proposition if you frame it that way. If you think about it, if you actually map it out, like, what is the career, what does the life of a writer look like, you would never do it because you would be crazy to do that. But if you just do it because you just feel it and you don't think about the other stuff and you maintain your day job, at least for the time being, it becomes this thing that's like, oh, all of a sudden I'm a writer. But how many people have you met who've always told you, like, oh, I've always wanted to write this book, and then they just never do because of
Mhm.
that risk, I think.
Yeah, I don't even think I, like, fully understood that I
That's for
was.
the best.
Yes, it is. I definitely, when I sat down to start, did not understand the work that was involved with writing a book, which, as you said, is absolutely for the best. I don't know if I would have dove in and actually started if I understood how much is involved with writing a book. It's, ignorance is bliss in that
Mhm.
case. But I don't even know if I fully understood that I was going to try and publish the book that I was writing. The
Right.
first book I actually wrote pretty much in secret. Like, my husband and my family
Me
knew
too.
that I was writing this book. Friends did not know. Like, people close to me other than family did not know.
Because you were probably embarrassed by it. I was embarrassed. I was almost ashamed.
I think I
Isn't it weird?
felt like telling somebody, "I wanna be an astronaut," like, out of the blue, you know? Like,
Oh my God, that's
it's
the
like
best
everyone knew me
analogy.
as a lawyer. For me to say, "Well, I'm writing this book," it just kind of felt a little off the wall to me.
Yeah.
And so it was just something that I did just in secret. And when the book, was going to get published and I started to tell people, one of my friends said, "Wait, that's why you're always in Starbucks with your laptop. That's what you were doing?"
It's like you're a problem drinker. That's like you go into a bar by yourself and you're hoping nobody sees you.
Well, and that's just it. And I actually ended up switching Starbucks a number of times because somebody would come in and I'm like, "Oh, this is their Starbucks." So I've got it. And, in New York, you can go 2 more blocks and there's another
Right.
Starbucks. So I was constantly changing Starbucks, almost like people were going to be on to me if they saw me here too
God, I've
much.
got a tail. I've got to switch cars.
Yes, exactly.
But I think you're absolutely right because it feels like you and I come from a little bit of a similar approach to writing in that we didn't take any classes. We didn't have any background in it. We just had
Mhm.
this idea. And in my case, I didn't even tell my wife at the time because I didn't know what I didn't even know what I was doing. And I really didn't want to tell anyone else because I thought you tell somebody you're writing a book and you've never done it before. And then for all I knew, I was going to get 50 pages in and not finish it. And
Yeah.
I didn't want to have that person then come back a year later, like, oh, what happened with that book? You're like, I didn't do it. So everything, and I didn't know what I was doing. So it's like,
Mhm.
I think your astronaut analogy is totally perfect. Like, there's no way I could be a writer. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, I can go through the motions, but I can't actually be a writer.
Yeah.
Because there's such a lack of self-confidence. No matter how confident you are in your everyday life, when it comes to writing, you're scared and you're like, I was very lucky to get an agent with my first book, but my first 3 books didn't sell. So
Yeah.
one, I want to go back a little bit. So you go to law school, you're a corporate attorney
Yeah.
for many, many, many years,
Mhm.
which is obviously, I assume, a solid, lucrative position to hold. And as a lawyer, you are learning to write. I mean, the physical act of writing is in whatever profession is challenging, and to build that muscle can apply to creative writing later on. So at least you have that down.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah,
start
it's
work.
very different though. The one thing, and I think because you're exactly right, especially in corporate law, there's a lot of writing involved. You're drafting contract after contract and the supplemental documents that go with that. And so I think that gave me kind of a bit of a blind confidence that I could write fiction because I draft these contracts.
Right.
Well, it is there is the writing muscle, but with drafting contracts, something that's important is that you don't leave any room for ambiguity in the contract. So you say the same thing like 20
There's
times.
no succinctness to it.
But you are not succinct in a contract. You are like one paragraph where you're defining one word is like you're defining it with every single adjective you can use
Right.
for
Which
that.
is which is poison to a suspense thriller writer.
Yes. So if you look at my first draft of my first book, I probably said the same thing over and over to not leave any ambiguity in the reader's mind, which, as you know, as a fiction reader and writer, is not
Right. We
entertaining.
get it.
Yeah, we get it. And so I did have some writing muscle, but I had to completely change it for fiction writing.
Yeah.
And that took time.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, maybe had you known about how difficult it is to write a novel, you might not have done it. The truth is, for me, that my first novel was easy to write because I didn't know what I was doing, and because I made all those mistakes. Getting better is the hard part.
Yeah, that's
But it's
true.
also the exciting part because it's, you look at every story as, my ninth book is coming out. Every story, I'm like, okay, what can I do better? What can I do different? How can I grow as a writer? And that's always fun, I think,
Mhm.
because the best thing about writing is you could do it at any age, and no matter how old you are, the best always may be yet to come.
Yes.
Um,
Well, congratulations on your ninth book. Incredible.
Thanks. I mean, I'm sure you feel the same way. It's like I never set out to say I'm going to write, a dozen books or whatever. It's like I guess I just do this now because I enjoy it,
Yes.
and you just keep doing it, and you don't think so much about you know when this sells, or because every writer's path is a roller coaster. I hear you can have a great book and then the next book totally fails. It just
Yeah.
happens. But if you love the writing, then it kind of doesn't matter. Whatever
Yeah.
happens is secondary. So I assume you started writing your first novel while you were still a practicing attorney.
No,
Oh,
actually. I had worked as a practicing attorney for a number of years, and I kind of thought that was what I was going to stick with. But at a certain point, but the hours are very long, and it was just something I didn't think that I was going to stick with long term. It sort of hit me that this wasn't going to be long term for me in this firm. But I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do, and I didn't want to leave without knowing what I was going to do. And, one night I was working very late, like, it was, like, 1 in the morning, and I was at my desk, and it sort of struck me that the practice of law is so different than what people see in movies and TV,
eh,
and I thought, "Someone should write a book about that in kinda like The Devil Wears Prada."
right.
Sort of like, I would read that, and then I thought, "Wait a second, I should write that book," and it was sort of something that, like, out of the blue. And so I grabbed a notebook and kind of jotted down a bunch of like things I'd witnessed, funny things I'd witnessed in meetings or conversations I'd had. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And I actually continued to write in that notebook for about a year.
Mhm.
But it wasn't like book form. It was really just notes, just ideas for this book. And after about a year, I thought, I actually want to do this for real, but I'm never going to do it if I stay in this job. Um, there really is no free time. As I said, I was at my desk at 1 in the morning doing work. So there just wasn't the free time. And so I kind of thought that now or never, and I know I don't want to be at the job anymore. And that was, so it was fine for me to leave it behind. And so I left the job and started writing the book.
Wow. Wow.
Mhm.
So did that feel like in that period of time where you've been working for a long time, and so not having a corporate job suddenly must in and of itself is weird, feels
Yes.
weird. And then I mean, honestly, I know I can't sit right 8 hours a day. That's ridiculous. It's so you might write a couple hours a day and you're like, what am I doing with my life? Is this okay? Is
Yeah,
this
yeah,
socially
there was a lot
acceptable?
of that. It definitely was that, and as I said, I wrote that book in secret, so there were a lot of questions of, "Wait, you resigned from your job? Well, what are you gonna do?"
Right.
I wasn't saying, "Well, I'm gonna write a book," so it was, I I had my first child soon after, so I think there was an assumption that I had left to have children, um but secretly, I was writing this book, and that eventually came out.
And that can be stressful on a relationship potentially if depending on the nature of your relationship, if you're both relying on each other for income, and then somebody says, I'm going to write a book, and then the other person starts researching how much writers make, and like, you're going to do what? I mean,
And I
I,
was really lucky. My husband was supportive. He's never known me as a writer before, and
right,
this was not something that had always been a dream of mine. Like, I wasn't in law
right,
school dreaming of writing a book.
right.
Like, this wasn't something that was even on my radar. So it certainly wasn't on my husband's radar that he was at some point gonna be married to a writer. So when I was approaching him saying, "I wanna leave my job and I wanna write this book," I was just so lucky that he was supportive. I
Yeah,
even asked him now, like, what were you, what were you thinking at the time? But he just, I mean, he had this blind confidence in me, and I was
that's
just really
great.
lucky for that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm the same. I had no aspirations to do so, but then it's kind of cool because it's like shifting careers. I mean, I didn't quit my day job, but it's like shifting careers to an industry that's so different. And so now you're like, now I get to learn about this industry and start learning about how publishing works, how
Mhm.
agents work. And then you start to realize, like, you know, most people don't even ever get an agent, much less
Yeah.
publish a book, much less ever get the ability to have an income that they can live off of from writing. I mean, that's, those are astronaut percentages.
Yes, that's very
Right.
true. And I'm actually, I didn't delve too much into it, which is weird because I am a bit of a planner, but for some reason I was just like, I didn't look that far down the line of agent, get it published. It was more I started with write this book. And it
Right.
was really, um, I was at least on the first draft or 2 or maybe even 3 before I thought, "Okay, what does one do with a finished manuscript?" And
Oh my God. Yeah.
that
That's
was
so
when I
funny.
started.
I preach that same thing. I'm like, I Googled what do I do with a 400-page manuscript? Like,
Yeah,
Google says get an agent. Like, cool. What's an agent? How do I
that was my process
Yeah.
pretty much. Like, it was I made the manuscript as good as I felt I could make it, and then I thought, "Okay, well, what do I do now?"
Yeah.
And, went through that definitely went through the Google process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time figuring out that next step because as you know, there's so much when you're Googling on agents and publishing, and you really have to, learn those next steps,
Right. Right.
research that.
Well, and there's such an art form. So I'm speaking from, I think I was querying in 2003. So the internet obviously was smaller back then. It
Yeah.
existed. But when it came to querying, it was snail mail. And so I was even thinking about, is this a nice quality paper? But, but
That
it's a
would be
real
stressful because that's sort of like resume. I remember doing that with my paper resume.
totally. It
Is
is.
this a good stock of paper? Will this be
Yeah. I
used
never
really
emailed
throw
my
it in the
query letters.
garbage?
And you would only send out like two, three, four at a time and wait. Because if they all rejected you and they all said the same thing, if they said anything at all, then you might want to adjust your query letter. But if you
Yeah.
mail out 100 letters at once, yeah, and there's a typo in them or whatever, you're
Well,
screwed.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, and I had, I think 75 rejections. And then I got an agent with my first book, which was lucky. Again, I was lucky, but it's really difficult. So you found, so you did query agents.
Well, so, I've had 2 different agents and kinda got them 2 different ways. So my first agent, this was incredibly fortunate. So I finished that book that we talked about. I did a lot of research. I drafted up a query letter, with the instructions that I did gathered from Google. And then, I took the first friend that I told was somebody who had worked at the same law firm, but she had since moved to another job. And she had been on a reality show called the Next Food Network Star. And
Huh.
from that, she was writing a cookbook. And so she had a literary agent. And so I told her about the book, kind of hoping for some like instructions of what did you do to get that agent? And she said, I love the sound of this book. Let me send it to my agent.
Hmm.
And I was expecting I was so happy about that, but I was expecting that her agent, would give me some feedback and I would take that feedback and that would be great. But she sent it to her agent, and her agent actually also used to work at a big corporate law firm. It was just sort of this
Huh.
fortune series of events. And so she really got the book
Hmm.
and, had come from a similar background to me. So she offered to represent me. So although I drafted my query letter and done all the research, I didn't end up querying that book. I got it. I got an agent very fortunately through a friend. Um, and she sold that book. The next book I wrote, a book called Just One Look, and that was a thriller. So I switched up genres on her, and she she just told me she thought the thriller market was pretty saturated, and she didn't think that she could sell the manuscript.
Hmm.
But I really felt strongly about that manuscript, so we we parted ways, and then I went into the query trenches. So I went into the query trenches with my second book.
Well, and for listeners who are super familiar with the query and agent process, your first agent, it's very rare that
Mm.
somebody who would represent a cookbook would also represent, fiction. It's, usually an agent will be like, not only I only represent fiction, but I only represent these two or three genres, perhaps.
Yeah.
So you were very fortunate to have somebody who was repping your friend's cookbook say, yeah, I will represent this as well. I get that you'd written about corporate law, so that resonated with her.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. She was a pretty new agent, and so the cookbooks were not, I think, what she wanted to do. She was doing that underneath the agent that she was assisting,
Got
and I
it.
think what she really wanted to do was women's fiction. So when
Right.
that came in, um, I think she was sort of happy to go that route rather than the cookbook route. I think a lot of agents start in whatever genre that the agent they're assisting is in, and then kinda go their own way.
Yeah. And it's important to know too that when you're looking for that next agent, and that next agent is looking for that next publisher, you have a book out there,
Mm.
which is both good and bad in the sense of like it's good that you have gone the traditional route and it's worked, but then they will look at sales, they will, yeah, all those things. There's a risk people are willing to take on a debut author, but once you have one book out there, all of a sudden that becomes, okay, how well did it sell? Can we bring up sales? And if it didn't sell well enough, sometimes they won't even touch you, even if they
Yeah,
love uh, the conceit of the manuscript. I don't know if you went
yeah.
into any of that.
That's true. I think having a book published traditionally with my first novel helped me get an agent, because they look at your query letter and they look that you have had a book published. But I was wishing I was a debut author with the second one, but it was my genre debut, which
Right,
can be helpful.
right, right. Yeah, and then did you find, so as you're going through this whole process and as you're kind of launching your second book, which is now a thriller, are you finding community? Are you going to conferences? Thriller Fest is in New York City. Do you go to that?
I do. I have been to 2 thriller fests, just this last year and the year before. Really, I was finding community online,
Yeah,
through social media. Uh, but I came into the genre not knowing a lot about the genre other than the
right,
books that I'd read,
right.
and I was happy to build a community after that.
Yeah. And genre is funny, right? Because eh, I think most people don't, especially it sounds like you, and I was the same way. You don't set out thinking, I'm going to write a thriller. It was my
Mhm.
agent who told me I was writing a thriller. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I didn't know. Here's a story that I thought was interesting.
Yeah,
Um, and it's easy to overthink, I think. And so, it's easy to get pulled into like, a thriller needs to have this and shouldn't have this. And I think that's dangerous if you start really thinking about adherence to a genre because genres are blurry, I think, to begin
mhm,
with.
yeah,
For me, it's the best just to write the story you want to tell and see what happens. And maybe that's being a little precious about it. My books will still all kind of thematically have elements that cross over, but I don't think about, well, I need to have the precipitating event happen within the first 23 pages,
yeah.
because it gets a little dangerous.
I agree, and there's such a range within the thriller genre. Sometimes even when I say that my next book was a thriller, I kind of am thinking, was it? Because it was a more psychological thriller. And you see it when you go to Thriller Fest. There's the John Grisham type of thriller,
Right.
and there's more the Gone Girl type of thriller. And
The
it's
Lee
a,
Child type of thriller,
yeah,
espionage.
it's such a range
Right.
within that genre. And so, I actually also started writing thrillers because of my agent. She didn't tell me I was writing one, but my first novel, which was women's fiction, in one of the um, edits that I was doing, the agent said, "Can you pace it more like a thriller?" And I didn't read thrillers at the time, and so I sort of was not sure what she meant by that. So I went and I got a bunch of thrillers, read them, studied the pacing, loved the short chapters, the
Hmm.
cliffhangers, the like can't put it down feeling of the books. And I thought my next book, I want it to be a thriller. I was already far along with that book to switch it up and completely make it a thriller, but I paced that one like a thriller. And then the next book, um, I wrote a thriller. So
Yeah.
my agent is really the one who ended up who I owe to coming into the thriller genre.
But your voice, I'm sure, kind of was born out of that. I mean, it probably took me 6 books to feel like, "Oh, I think this is my voice."
Mhm.
And everything that you're describing in terms of, the pacing and the short chapters, the cliffhanger endings, etcetera, all of that I feel like comes alive in the editing. Like, it's good to
Yeah.
for me, it's good to just get the story down
Yeah.
and then read it fresh and read it almost with a rhythm in your
Yeah.
head. And, you know, and it, because then if you force it, it reads forced, right?
Oh, yeah,
The
absolutely.
pacing,
Yeah.
and you can recognize that in stuff that you read of
Yeah.
others. You're like, this feels like they're just trying too hard to make this a thriller.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as you said, there is a certain formula of a certain percentage and this has to happen, a certain
Right.
percentage and this has to happen. Um, and I try to avoid that just because I think sometimes you can be reading a book and you're like, I see why you dropped that there. It can be a little bit forced.
Right.
And as you said, those things like a cliffhanger ending on a chapter, those do happen in later drafts.
Yeah.
My first draft is getting the story down. I actually, in my last book, when I was going back for an edit, I had in parentheses at the end of one of my chapters, put something suspenseful here. What am I even thinking there? But
But I think it's important
yeah,
to note that that cliffhanger ending and that puts something suspenseful. It doesn't have to be somebody getting shot in the kneecaps.
no,
It can be just a tone of somebody's voice or somebody looking out the window and, thinking about the future. It could just be that a little bit of a sense of maybe dread or
mhm.
anticipation to keep somebody wanting to turn the page to the next chapter, I find.
Absolutely. I think even just like a sense of foreboding, or you've raised a question in the reader's mind. A box is delivered to the door at the end of the chapter, and the reader wants to know what's in the box. Like
Right.
when you finish that chapter, hopefully there's a question in your reader's mind from that chapter
Right.
that propels them into the next one. And it's not that your protagonist is on the edge of a cliff and will they jump every single
Right.
time.
Yeah,
It's
right. Right. Cause that gets boring,
that's
you know?
boring, and it's too much. You have to have like, there has to be a certain rhythm in a book, and as you said, that rhythm of the book comes out in the edits. It's definitely not in people's first draft, or at least but maybe with people who are more talented than I am, but the rhythm is not in my first draft. The story is in my first draft, and then that rhythm and those little cliffhangers and those questions, those come out in later drafts.
And it might not even right, and those drafts might not even be just drafts that you're looking at. I mean, because so much happens after your agent reads it, but
Yeah,
certainly after your editor reads it,
yeah,
it can change, hugely after
yeah,
that, and usually for the better because 'cause you're like, I was so close to this book. Yeah, and you're so right in your comments. I could never have seen that on my own because 'cause I've
yeah.
rewritten this thing 4 times and I'm sick of it at this
Mhm.
point. I mean, I'm a big believer in that there's no one way to write a novel. I think people who suggest that it's ridiculous. The idea, and you're right that the idea of a precipitating event has to happen quickly. But if you approach it in the sense of, if I were reading this book or if I were seeing this on Netflix, would this first 30 pages or the first 10 minutes of the show be interesting to me the way that I have it right now?
Yeah.
And then if the answer is no, you're like, well, what's missing? And you just kind of go with your gut after a while, but you train your gut, I think, over the course of writing hundreds of thousands of words and reading other books like it.
Yeah. It can be hard when you've read your manuscript so many times because those first 30 pages, you're like, I've read this so many times. I'm bored.
Yeah.
Is a fresh reader bored by this? And
Right.
sometimes that can be hard for you to tell you to figure out yourself. So it is when I get my editorial letter, there's always this moment when I first read it, and my first reaction is always like, no, like that's not the way it should go.
Hmm.
I can't make any of these changes. Like this is disaster. Um, and then slowly you come up, well, I mean, it's within 24 hours as my mind is kind of, percolating on what my editor has said. I'm like, okay, yeah, that would make it better. And
Right.
that would be better. And that would make it better. And this is why they do the job that they do, because they can see things we don't see. They can make the manuscript so much better. But always my first reaction, because you're so attached to how it's written, you're like, no, that character couldn't possibly do that. I couldn't possibly move that earlier in the story at all. It just is supposed to be the way it is. And then you realize your editor knows how it should be.
My first reaction is always like, oh, you're totally right, but that's gonna be a lot of work. It's
Well, you come
overwhelming.
around faster than I do.
Oh, yeah, again, after 20 years of doing this, I still lack confidence in
Mhm.
writing, which I think has served me.
Yeah.
Um, and out of all the editorial letters I've had, I think I don't know if there's anything I ever refused to do. I think very few things I've ever pushed back on. And most things I look
Mhm.
at, I'm like, oh, you're right. Because not only are they reading it as a fresh pair of eyes, they're also reading it from the perspective of a bookseller who
Yeah.
understands market trends and understands that your book is a commodity that they want to sell as many copies of.
Mhm.
And they might approach things a little bit differently than you would as an artist because of that.
Yeah.
Not that you're trying to sell out, but even something like an ending is a good example. So, I've had editors say, I think the book ends here 20 pages earlier than you have it, even though you love how you wrote those last 20 pages. And you're like, oh, I think you're right. But it sucks to cut those, but I think you're right. But that's much more of a commercial perspective, I think, than the writer has.
It's always painful to cut those pages because they're always the ones that you love so much, but it absolutely makes it a better book.
Right.
But you realize that, and I mean, when you're a writer like yourself who has 9 published books, writing is a business. You know that book publishing is a business and you want to sell the book, and so you are willing to make it a little bit more commercial, to make it more interesting for a reader. At least I'm willing to do that. There's very little that I've pushed back on, not because I just always will take what my editor says, but because they're almost always right
Right.
about it.
Right.
I will consider what they've said. I'll be reading the manuscript and I'll think, okay, yeah, that is that does make it a better book. And even the stuff, I don't even say that I pushed back on it. It's just I'll say I don't think that that part works, and she just says okay. Like she's not like no, it does. Like it hasn't really been a pushback. It's just I give my opinion and she accepts it,
Right.
because I mean, it's so rare. I think there'll be like
Right.
a minor thing that I think if I drop a clue too early, it's too obvious. And
Right.
she just that's okay.
And that's sometimes when it's nice to get your agent involved just for another opinion.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like the arguments we tend to have happen over like titles, because almost inevitably I get my titles changed, which is fine. I get that.
Yeah.
And then they give us a title and I either love it or I hate it or there's somewhere in between. And it's usually not a hill I'm going to die on.
Mhm.
But when the titles come to me, they come to me focus group tested, stuff
Yeah.
that I never did, obviously, and from people who this is their job. Their job is titling books and doing covers and understanding what it looks like when you're flipping through your phone screen and seeing the book cover.
Yeah.
So I'm like, who am I to if this title out of 40 different titles scored the highest in focus groups and algorithmic testing, who am I to say no, it can't be that? So it
Well,
is
that's just it. There's so many people involved in the publishing of your book. And this is like your profession as a writer, their profession is selling the book. And so you have to have a certain amount of respect for they know what title is better. They know what
right.
cover is better, or just things like that. You have to just respect their expertise sometimes, unless you feel really strongly about it. Like I did, like I got a book cover for my last book that I really didn't like. Uh, but even with that, it wasn't it wasn't a battle between me and the publisher where they were saying you must take this cover. I went back and I said that I didn't really like this one, and they went back to the designer and showed me another one, and that was the one that we
Yeah.
ended up going with. So it wasn't,
Right.
um, I mean, I think I went to my agent first and said that I didn't like it because you're right. It is good to kind of have the conversation with your agent just because maybe you're too close to something. Maybe you want another opinion. Um, but there hasn't been anything for me. I've been fortunate. There hasn't been anything where I've thought, oh, I really dislike that title or I really dislike that cover, but the publisher is sort of steamrolling it through. I haven't had that experience. I
Yeah.
haven't had that experience with my editor or with my publisher. Um, Maybe I've been fortunate with that.
I think, well, no, I think that's very rare that that happens. And I think when that does happen, it's usually with less experienced editors or publishers.
Yeah.
Once you get a really respected editor and a publisher, it is a lot of back and forth. And
Yeah.
I think what writers have to understand, first of all, if you get a book published, you are in rare form and you are very fortunate and you should consistently be grateful of that fact, regardless of how big your publisher is.
Yeah.
And then to realize everybody on that team all has the same objective, including you, is to sell as many books as possible.
Mhm.
That's it. And everyone's job is geared towards that. So it doesn't serve you any good to be difficult to work with. And
Yeah.
because publishers could be like, man, there are a lot of writers out there who would love to be in your position. We can choose any of those. And it's just not worth it for us if you're just going to be a difficult person to work with. But a lot of people, I don't think, do that. I think there are a lot of difficult writers out there. And, even if they're successful, I think who wants to work with difficult people? I don't.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right that it is. You have to remind yourself you're all on the same team. Like they don't want your book to flop. They
Right.
paid for it. So
Right.
like
Right.
you want your book to be successful. They want the book to be successful. You're all moving towards the same goal. You may have some disagreements on how you get to that goal, but it's good to remember that you're all on the same team. You all want success for the same book.
Absolutely. And so with the release, the recent release, May, I believe, of your second thriller, No One Needs to Know, what was what was that? Well, first of all, that release experience wasn't during a pandemic, so it was
Mhm.
different than
Yeah.
the one prior, I assume.
Yeah.
What has, you know, has anything shifted substantially? Has anything changed? The process of releasing this book, was there anything real eye-opening about it, or it just feels like, okay, yeah, this feels familiar, and now we'll do the next book and build on that?
This question. So as you said, my suspense debut came out during the pandemic in July of 2021. It was kind of an odd time during the pandemic. Some people were, you know, meeting up again, but some weren't. And so I didn't end up, like I did a lot of podcasts, but no in-person events. And so that was a really nice thing about this launch was I could do an in-person
Mhm.
launch. Felt great. And so that was something that was different and really enjoyable about this one. In terms of other things with the launch, I other things felt pretty similar.
Yeah, yeah. And is it advantageous? Yeah, I don't is your agent in New York?
She is, yeah.
So you've got an agent and a publisher. in the same city that you live in.
Yes.
Which I can't imagine. My agents in New Orleans, my publishers in Chicago, I
Yeah.
never see them. You know, I didn't meet my agent probably for 5 years after having her. Is it is that something that you're actually you see them often? You have lunch, or is it not really?
Not really. I I mean, I've always wished that it's sort of more like TV where you and your agent are talking about your book all the
You're having
time.
a three
I mean,
martini
you just have
lunch
time for
and
that. I don't have time for that. It's not like it is in TV where you're
right,
constantly
totally.
having lunches. But I've had some great meetups with mostly it'll be my editor and my agent. Sometimes we're, celebrating the launch of a book or just having lunch, but not as often as you would think. And that is a little bit probably still pandemic related.
Yeah,
Not everybody's in the office. But when we do get together for lunch, it's very nice.
it's a good time.
It's nice. The only people I hadn't met was my marketing and publicity team. Um, but I got to meet them at my launch, and so it is nice to be in the same city.
That's awesome. Well, listen, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do a very brief storytelling. So this is the fun part of the show. Not that the rest hasn't been fun, but this is the fun and nervous and exciting part of the show. I'm going to pick. Well, I'm going to actually ask you for a color, and you're going to give me a color. I'm going to find a book of that color. I'm going to open it, or we're going to pick a random page and a random sentence. I will read that sentence, and that'll be the first sentence in maybe a 2 minute long short story. So I'll read that sentence. You give me maybe the next one or two sentences, whatever you want to do. I'll do the next one or two, and in like 2 minutes, I'll call it a day.
Right.
So give me a color.
Blue.
Okay, I don't think I've done blue before. Let me see. I didn't have a lot of blue books. I almost picked Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger, but there's so many weird sentences in that book. And I thought that might be a little bit risky.
That might be
So,
difficult.
so this is actually a buddy of mine who we've been in the same critique group for probably nearly 20 years at this point. And this is a collection of short stories called 17 Stitches, and his name is Sean Eads. So dark stuff. Give me a page number between 1 and 280.
100.
Okay. And this is from this is from the short story titled Coffin. Um,
They're going dark.
we are going dark. All right, I'm just going to read this sentence, and then you do whatever whatever you want with it. Her skin still felt smooth.
That was surprising to me, although this was the first time that I'd ever touched a dead body.
More surprising since she'd clearly been laying out in the dirt under the Tucson sun for at least 2 days. I would have expected it to be blistered. Maybe she hadn't been here that long.
I scanned the horizon, hoping that I was the only one there, but that was when I spotted him.
There was just a single tree in my view, probably 100 yards down, and he stepped from behind it. Enough movement that the two birds in the tree scurried away. He was wearing all black, which didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was what he was holding in his hand.
My eyes widened as the baby let out a shriek. That was my son.
I stood here, frozen to the ground. They always talk about fight or flight, and yet I seem incapable of both in the moment. He starts walking towards me, and all I can do is feel ice in my stomach just watching him hold the baby.
My gun is in the holster within reach. I rest my hand on the handle, but don't trust my aim.
I have a momentary thought that this is all a coincidence, that he didn't even know I was here. But then the sickening feeling hits me. He thinks I did this to her. He thinks I killed her, his wife. And now he's going to do the same thing to my child.
Oh, that's good.
We can call it there because this is going to get real dark real fast.
That's real dark, but I think we have something there.
I think so. I think I can. I don't know when you write, but I see it. You know, it's important for me to see it, but I also can't help it. I kind of see it. And I'm like, yeah, it looks like this, as if I'm watching a TV show. So
Yeah.
I picture this scene completely in my head, vividly. And it's I was not expecting. The baby threw me. I'm like, oh my God, that's so twisted.
Well, I was gonna say gun, but I'm like, no, let's throw something completely
Right.
off the wall in this.
And that's the beauty of doing this exercise. And I do consider it a very constructive exercise, and it helps me challenge myself when I'm writing is just deciding on a premise and then almost forcing yourself to go with it. So you say
Yeah.
something that I can't say, no, that's not it. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's not what I was thinking, but now I'm going to go in this direction. Isn't that interesting? Because now maybe we have something that very different than what I would have expected, but probably better.
Well, you're very good at that.
Look, I've done 100 of these, so you get good over time, but it's still, I get nervous every time.
Well, I was nervous. I'm like, I don't know where I'm going with this.
Well, Lindsay, what a great opportunity to be able to chat with you, and congratulations on your recent release. That's very exciting. It's always a fun time when that happens, and then I'm sure you're just busy away your next one, and we'll get to go through the whole thing again probably next year.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, and congratulations on book 9 for you.
Thanks very much. Hope to see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
So that's it. That is my conversation with Lindsay Cameron. And God damn it, that story started to get really dark. Once you introduce a scene with a dead body and a live baby, it gets pretty twisted pretty quickly. Now she was fantastic. I love that chat. And I highly recommend you check out her new book, No One Needs to Know. I highly recommend you go learn more about her at her website, which is just lindsayjcameron.com. And please, while you're on the internet, hop on over to my website, carterwilson.com. Buy my books. You can check out my appearances. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I release once a month regularly for the past 6 years. And check out if I'm offering a retreat that you might want to go to, a writing retreat. I do all of those things. That's it for now. As always, I appreciate you watching and or listening to this. And you know what? Probably next week, there's going to be a new episode out. So look for that. In the meantime, take care.